This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A really interesting guest today, Dylan Evans, British academic and author. He's written a good number of books. The one subject, though, that he really touched on that caught my eye was this idea of risk intelligence. Risk intelligence. Expected value, bet sizing, luck, certainty, process versus outcome. I think he does a fantastic job of getting at these issues. And these are the issues. Mission critical, not only to trading, but to life. Because look, when you're a trader, you got to know your expected value. You got to know it. You got to have your bet sizing down. But if you're a kid and your parents tell you can't play dodgeball anymore, your parents tell you that you've got to wear a helmet perhaps, please, children, I know the kids probably aren't listening to this today, but if your parents start telling you that you have to wear a helmet to go to school and you can't play dodgeball, run away. Find new parents. That's bad risk intelligence. Tangent over. Dylan Evans' interview follows. Hey, listen, I have to tell you out of the gate. So in my world, I write about traders who employ the same type of mentality, thought process, philosophical worldview as you describe in your work. And I really think your TED video on looking at expert gamblers, that's one of the best explanations. I give you all the props for that. It's a great explanation. Maybe I'm too far into it, so it just resonates with me. I don't know how the average person feels about it, if it goes over their head, if they get it. But I thought it was great. You know,
it's funny. I think people, about 25% of people maybe get it straight off the bat, and the rest find it a real struggle. There's not many people in the middle. It does seem to there's some kind of mindset that it seems to gel with, and if you don't have that mindset, it's really hard to wrap your head around it.
Yeah, because when you start talking about expected value, I think unless you're just have the natural math aptitude and you have that firm statistical understanding as a young person, maybe when you get older, you hear it's like, oh, I don't want to go back to college. But it's so cool if you can wrap your arms around it.
Right, yeah, because you can apply it to so much more than, just gambling, or not even just necessarily even, financial stuff. The expert gamblers I interviewed, they were, one of the questions I would ask them was always, do you apply this way of thinking to other things in your life? And they would always say, yeah, I mean, I think about almost everything in my life in this way, from relationships to, going on holiday to buying insurance to whatever, so, that's kind of funny.
Let me take a step back though, before I get too far in and I don't give you a chance to define everything. So you've also got this great phrase, that you, in your work called risk intelligence. Why don't you go ahead and define risk intelligence for the audience?
Sure. Well, I define risk intelligence as the ability to estimate probabilities accurately. And in that simple definition, there's a whole lot of quite complex thought packaged into it. So the idea is that a lot of us, in fact, all of us regularly have to try and figure out what the chances are of various things happening in our lives, whether it's the chance that we'll get a job or the chance that it's going to rain today, if we're deciding what kind of clothes we're going to wear in the morning, up to really big things like what are the chances of surviving a very serious operation? Should I have this chemotherapy? Should I have a breast removed? If I've got a breast cancer. So we have to operate in this world of probabilities, but Many of us are really bad at operating in that world, and we consistently overestimate the chances of good things happening to us, and they underestimate the chances of bad things happening, and a whole range of that's called optimism bias. So there's a whole range of biases that stop us thinking clearly about probabilities. And risk intelligence is the ability to do that well. So relatively few people have high risk intelligence.
Let me give an example that I think you can play off. A couple years ago, I did a documentary film. I went and interviewed people that played the lottery in the state of Virginia. And I had people literally on video interviews say they were playing the lottery because they thought it was a form of retirement. And that the probabilities just did not resonate at all. And clearly, the numbers of people that play the lottery across the world are vast, all countries.
Right. Yeah. And I forget who it was. It may have been Benjamin Franklin who said that the lottery was a tax on fools. And it's a bit harsh to put it like that. But the point is well taken, I think. Yeah, that nobody with high risk intelligence would play the lottery because the payoff, is just too low to justify the risk. Even though the risk is only, $1 or, a small amount of money, it's still the chances of winning are so low that you will, on average, lose money. Everybody will.
Well, let me jump into an example that I mentioned the TED video and you discuss it, but I want to ask a few things about it. So I had a chance about a year ago to interview one of the MIT blackjack team leaders, a guy named Micah Ponte. And I've interviewed multiple professional poker players and many very large hedge fund managers that work within the expected value mental framework that you're so right in the middle of. When you look at all those people that have that success, and you got the audience of lay people out there, and they hear about these people that have mastered numbers and they've mastered this ability to kind of be an expert in this world of probabilities and understanding uncertainty. What's the commonality? What have they figured out that mere mortals have not figured out?
Well, one thing that I would start off by saying is that they're not you don't have to be some kind of Rain Man genius to do what these people are doing. It doesn't tally or correlate with IQ. So, you can have people with very high IQ who are terrible at operating in this kind of world of probabilities. And you can have, people with very low IQ who are really good at it. So the two things just don't match up. And it's not about necessarily having a high degree of education either, or being a math whiz kid. Okay, you have to be comfortable with numbers. That's a different thing. But you feel at home with numbers, but you don't necessarily, the actual math involved is in many cases can be quite simple. Some cases it's not, but in a lot of cases you can get by with quite simple math. I think what really marks these people out, though, is an ability to be several things, really. Firstly, to be really honest with themselves about how much they know and how much they don't know, and to build up knowledge carefully and patiently in the areas where it matters to them, and to recognize that, if there's something they don't know about, it's not worth betting on or making an investment in. So that's something, it's this kind of degree of real honesty with themselves, and often honesty with other people that goes along with it. They tend to be quite blunt. That can sometimes be, get them into trouble. Another thing is they work really hard and they're very disciplined. So typically, they'll think about these. If they're the expert gamblers I've interviewed in particular would think and live and breathe gambling every day, almost every day of the year. So they were dedicated, they were disciplined, they would work hard, and they would also keep records. So they knew exactly where they'd gone wrong. They would learn from their mistakes. And I think it's that. So really it's not as if you don't have to have some superhuman thing. Almost anyone can do it if they really try. So sometimes I would ask gamblers, if you say anyone can do it, why is it that most people don't? And, a lot of the times they would just say to me, it's simple. People are lazy.
Let me jump into an issue about a good example that you bring up in your work. And you were at not you, but you looked at some research that involved the Brandywine Raceway in Delaware. And I think the interesting thing that you found there and you discuss in your writings, and I believe it was another paper, another group of guys had done this paper, and you were looking at the research. But they found that there was a group, there was two different types of groups, but there was one group that was essentially doing unconsciously this complex statistical modeling in their heads. And that was a real breakthrough, I believe, in your understanding of this whole process.
Right. Yeah. And this goes back to the idea about, IQ not being related to it, because a lot of these guys, they didn't, they tested their IQ and it had no relationship to whether they were good at estimating. These were guys who went to the racetrack every day and would try to work out the probability that each horse would win the race. And it turned out that about half of the people, that these two psychologists who wrote the paper, Stephen Sessi and Jeffrey Lacan, turns out that half the people they studied were really good at this, and half the people were just really average. And when they looked at the difference between these two sets of people, they realized that it was nothing to do with IQ or education, but that something about the first group, the group that was good, enabled them to be doing, as you say, some kind of complex statistical modeling in their heads, but they didn't even realize that's what they were doing. It's not that they were doing it consciously, it's that their brains were all doing it, as it were, for them. And it was something about the way they were learning from their experience. They were paying attention to their mistakes. And because of that, their brains were able to learn and build a kind of linear model of the various factors involved in predicting a horse's chances of winning a race.
Were they able to kind of figure out what type of system, or was each individual kind of developing their own system built on iteration of experience, or were they able to isolate what type of system the successful?
Yeah, they were actually. They did actually find that they managed to build a model that seemed to fit the data pretty well. The data they got from interviewing these racetrack patrons, and they found that they could pretty much understand what these guys were doing, and they were all men, by assuming that they had a kind of model in their heads which consisted of 7 variables. Variables like how many times the horse had won a race in the past season, something like that, or what was its average winnings. I can't remember the exact variables that they were paying attention to, but they isolated these 7 variables, and they found out that that was probably what the men were paying attention to, and they were kind of appropriately weighting each of these variables and crunching the numbers unconsciously and spitting out a probability for each horse in each race.
Let me shift gears on you. So when we think about probabilities, I think one of the favorite examples of, people think about flying. There's plenty of people that don't want to fly because they're scared to death about flying and they see these horrible accidents, but everyone actually does know it's pretty safe, even if they can't get past the probabilities of how safe they really are. But let's look at something like the nuclear issue, whether it's Chernobyl or the situation in Japan in the last couple of years. You always hear the statistics. This is extremely safe, extremely safe. However, when one goes bad, it's so overwhelmingly bad. How does that type of, because it's different than just, let's say, one particular plane having an accident and a small number of people. The nuclear issue lives on. Talk about that some in your work and how you've looked at that.
Right. Well, we even some people with very high risk intelligence find this kind of question intuitively difficult. That's where we really do have to start, using some kind of math, some kind of, pen and paper, just to do some basic calculations, because our brains find it extremely difficult, even if we've got high risk intelligence, to deal with these cases where we have very low probabilities. I mean, probabilities of, much less than 1%. or so, a 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 kind of odds, or even maybe more unlikely. And when you combine that, though, with maybe a very low probability but very high impact event, the kind of thing that, Nicholas Nassim Taleb famously calls black swans, we all find it very difficult to figure out what we should do. But typically, when you multiply, because you can come out with anything, you just have to change the numbers a little bit, and it can go from something that you don't need to worry about to something that you really, really should worry about. So this is where it becomes very difficult, and we really just need to start gathering real data and figuring it all out on paper.
Let's talk about the idea too, making decisions on uncertain information. This, and in my world, and I know you have some experience this too, the investing world, it is constant. There is no certainty. Now, all of the major media players, the big brokerage firms, etc., they love to give the story of certainty. But I think everybody deep in their gut knows it's extremely uncertain. And one of the things, and this is you found, and clearly I've seen this too, is that in the expert gamblers, there is what you call an expected value mindset, essentially. And it also exists in the good traders. So can you explain to the audience the idea of expected value?
Right. So the idea here is that if you want to decide whether or not to make a bet or invest in a certain stock, or ultimately to take any decision, you can actually use the same basic maths to do it. And what you do is you just take the probability of some event occurring, and then you multiply that by the amount of money that you would gain or lose by making that choice. And if the result is positive, you should basically make the decision, make the bet, make the investment, whatever. And if it's negative, you shouldn't. That's simplifying things a little bit, but that's the basic idea. So to go back to the example we were just discussing of the very low probability but very high impact event, we have a really good example. Even if it's a very, very low probability, maybe 1 in a million, but the impact of that is going to be so devastating that it could result in maybe tens of millions of lives lost, then it can still be very worthwhile spending money to mitigate that risk. Because when we multiply those numbers out, it still comes out as a big number, even though the probability is very small.
So if we stay in this expected value type thinking. We're playing a game, where they're playing the game of blackjack, or we're playing the game of investing. And this is a long run type of thinking. This is not, you don't wake up and say, what did Facebook stock do today? But this is more, you're trying to find the expected value for a game and then playing that in a consistent way over the long term. But once you have that expected value, and I want you to talk about this next issue, is it really next comes down to your bet size. What are you going to do? If you have that expected value on your side, how are you going to play the game in terms of betting?
Right. Yeah. So this is something that some gamblers, some investors neglect, is that, this crucial aspect, not just of when to bet, but of how much you should bet or how much you should invest on any particular occasion. And it's kind of a complex issue because you have to take into account various factors. First, you have to take into account the probability of winning again. So the probability of winning doesn't necessarily just dictate whether or not you should make your bet or your investment, but also how much you should bet on any particular occasion. And there are ways of using that. A very simple rule of thumb might be to invest a certain amount of money which is proportionate to your degree of making a profit, to the probability that you'll make a profit. But the other factor you have to take into account, of course, is the size of your bankroll. Because the most important thing when you're betting or investing is to make sure that you can always bet again. So there's no point in betting more than even if the probability of making a profit is high, that if you bet too much and then the bet doesn't come off, you can go bankrupt, you can run out of money, and that means you're out of the game. You can't continue to bet. And that's the thing, the ultimate thing that you must always strive to avoid. So you have to play cautiously to some extent. And there are various rules, again, that have been devised, like the Kelly criterion, which say, dictate exactly, how much you should bet as a fraction of your current bankroll.
If we're just talking about investing for a second, I've actually asked audiences before, and there's several hundred people out in the audience, and I say, okay, you've got this hypothetical $100,000. You're getting ready to start investing. You're going to take your first trade, and give me a show of hands. Or tell me how much are you betting? And surprisingly, you can have people that will raise their hand, and I don't know if they're just in a desire to quickly answer the question, or they're not thinking where they truly believe it. But I've had people regularly say, "Oh, $10,000. I'm going to bet $10,000. I'm going to bet 1/10 of my bankroll on my first trade." And there's no expert gamblers and no expert traders that bet that heavy.
Right. Yeah. And you can another sort of related phenomenon there is that if someone bets, say, even if they bet a relatively small and cautious amount on their first few gambles or investments or trades, and then if they do well on those first few trades, then what happens is they're often tempted to, they get buoyed up by the joy of winning, as it were, and they kind of maybe unconsciously think they're on a roll or something like that, and they then increase the size of their bet when really, an expert gambler wouldn't do that. Then they lose big time. And you see this in some interesting, a lot of historical data in trading shows this effect. And this can often mean that, their winnings are wiped out, and then over the course of that actually skews their profits for the whole of the rest of the trade, of the sequence of trades they do.
So there's probably some people out there thinking right now, well, you guys have got it all figured out. You find your expected value. If you can live forever, you just play the game. However, what if you get unlucky? What if it goes against you? And I think maybe, and I want you to expand on this, luck or being unlucky, it's always part of the game. I think the thing we can best do is, with an uncertain playing field in front of us, is to find the expected value in whatever game we're playing and stick with it. That doesn't mean that we can't take it on the chin, though, right?
Right, yeah. And, I think there's, as Clint Eastwood says in one of his movies, if you want a guarantee, buy a toaster. And I think that's a kind of embodies a certain wisdom. But, there's ultimately, there are no absolute guarantees. There are just ways of playing well. But even if you play incredibly well, even if you make your decisions according to the most rational way possible, you have as much information as you can possibly get, etc., that you can still have a run of bad luck. You can still, even the smartest person can have a run of bad luck and perhaps, go bankrupt. So that's just part of of life, and I think part of being a good gambler or a good trader or a good investor is reacting, not overreacting to bad news, like in the same way as you shouldn't overreact to good news, and being able to really take it on the chin when the luck goes against you, and to really one of the hallmarks, I guess, that I've found of a good gambler or a good trader is that they feel happy or sad about their trades or their bets, not depending on the outcome so much, whether they win or lose, whether they make a profit or a loss, but on the quality of their decisions.
Did they play the game right? Did they play the game right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. If they screw up, if they realize they made a bad decision, and that just because they didn't consider the information well enough or whatever, that really annoys them, and they want to learn. Even if they were lucky and they turned, they actually won the bet or made a profit. And conversely, if they made a really good decision, they knew that they really figured it out, and then it didn't pay off. They were unlucky. There was some black swan or whatever that surprised them, and they made a loss. that doesn't really faze them because they know that can happen and they know they made the decision well.
I had one guy I spoke to, and he, a very famous poker player, and he sat down at a table and he was the rock star, and it was kind of a casual thing in Vegas. And I guess there was maybe, I don't know how many other people at the table, but they were all excited that he sat down. They were, he was going to play, however long he was going to play. But I guess the way everything was dealt in the first bunch of hands, in his head, what he was crunching, the numbers were not there. And so even though everybody at the table knew this guy was multimillionaire, massively successful, and they just wanted to have fun, he saw the hands roll out. He crunched the numbers in his head. He stood up and said, "Nah, I'm not playing." He knew he was sticking to his system. Even in a casual game, he could not stick to his system. He had to stick to his system. And it was kind of like everyone was upset that he just wouldn't sit around and play to lose, maybe.
Right. Yeah, I think that's another interesting characteristic of good traders, good gamblers, is that they know when not to bet. They can always walk away. There's at the racetrack, you see the opposite, and in casinos, you see this all the time. People haven't been, they've had a bad day at the track or whatever. And then there's one last race and, they don't know anything about the horses, but they just think, right, I'm going to throw another bet down because I've got to win now. I've got to come away feeling, that's just a crazy way to think. One famous gambler I interviewed said, his phrase was, "There's always another race." That's the way you have to think when you're a gambler. You can always come back and bet later. You don't have to bet now.
So in your world of looking at risk intelligence, I have a question. So as I look at risk in other areas of our life, whether it's, I mentioned flying, whether it could be helicopter parenting, they're banning dodgeball, or what's happened at the airports post 9/11. So we've got a situation where the powers that be, and I just want you to kind of comment on this philosophically, but the powers that be have deemed certain acts risky by however they're measuring it, which I think is perhaps overdone, but they've deemed certain acts risky. What becomes, though, the unintended consequences of trying to eliminate risk in a system where risk is never going to be eliminated? I wonder if we as a society and people are thinking about those unintended consequences.
Well, I think we're not. I think that society, as a society, in the West in particular, as we've got more affluent and society has got more technologically advanced over the last few decades, we have become increasingly risk averse. And you mentioned a few examples there, in terms of parenting, in terms of response to terrorist threats and so on. These all seem perfectly rational at one level, but there are often hidden costs that we don't consider. So, for example, with parenting, if we don't if we're so worried about our kids playing alone in a park, for example, that we keep them inside much more than people used to, then maybe, we can feel happier that they're not going to be abducted by a stranger, which is in fact incredibly rare. But as a result, maybe they become just more emotionally dependent and less autonomous, and that's a very probable outcome. And it's less obvious, right? Or with the case of terrorism, we beef up the security regulations, and as a result, there are longer queues. And as a result, some people choose to drive instead of fly short distances. And as a result, people have more road accidents, and maybe there are more deaths overall. So I think, risk follows the waterbed principle. If you try to push it down in one part, it'll pop up in another part. Mm-hmm. And people don't recognize that. They don't want to recognize that. We're chasing this illusion of a risk-free life. And I think it's a shame because, the thing that made America great was, this risk-loving frontier spirit, that was made, evident throughout the sort of Wild West in the 19th century, and the entrepreneurialism that still makes Silicon Valley great and stuff like that. It's that risk-taking ability to take intelligent risks and to accept that, that you could come out seriously worse off. But nevertheless, that ability to take those risks, that's what has driven society forward throughout history. And I do worry that if we kind of forget that and we kind of become too risk averse, that, that's going to have, consequences, which, is going to rob society of some of its vitality.
It's interesting. I wonder, and you might have some feedback on this too, is that policymakers, politicians, government leaders, bankers, they're not oblivious to the conversation that you and I are having, but it sure seems like they're either ignoring it on purpose or for some other reason. And I should add, though, for most of this year, I've traveled Asia, and people can have all kinds of debates about the forms of government across Asia, whether it's Thailand or China or Vietnam, where I'm at today. But there seems to be a lot of risk taking. There's a massive amount of risk taking in China. Whether it all works out or not, I don't think that's necessarily the point. But they're not sitting still. And I think you make an operative point about the West, that maybe we've gotten, and I'll just say it this way, maybe we've gotten a little fat and happy.
Well, that's true, but there's also, the additional thing to think about, which is, a crucial difference between the West and China, which is democracy. And as soon as let me make it clear, I would much prefer to live in a democratic system, but it does have some downsides. And the downside is that when you have elected politicians that have to worry about getting reelected, the main risks for them are not necessarily the risks for the population as a whole, but the risk of not getting reelected.
Yes, that's the golden nugget right there. That's the home run piece that no one wants to admit to.
Right. And, sure, there may be overall more road deaths by implementing more tighter security measures in the airports. But if you don't implement those security measures and a terrorist incident gets perpetrated at an airport or on a plane, you are going to lose the election because people are going to blame you for not putting in place those measures. So, whereas in, say, China, the leaders don't really have to worry about not getting reelected because there's no democracy there. So they can take risks with maybe the population as a whole, which may be a good and advantageous for at least some sections in terms of material progress and so on. So, I think there's a whole other range of factors to consider. Politicians are not necessarily doing everything for the good of the people.
Yeah. Let me go into something that you have developed and put online that I think anybody can participate in. And I don't want you to describe this, but you've essentially put a risk intelligence test. Is that or what you're calling it on your website that people can go and go through a process to better understand where they might come in where they might come out on their own current risk intelligence?
Yes, this is, I've made a simple version of what technically is called a calibration test, but, that's the sort of technical term that psychologists use. I've called it a risk intelligence test because I think it kind of communicates the idea slightly better, but, anyone can take it for free. It's on the website, www.projectionpoint.com, and people can go there and they just have to estimate the chances they have to work out how likely they think that certain statements are true, and then they can get a quick idea of how good they are at estimating probabilities.
So one last quick question. So here we are in 2013. We're talking about this subject, expected value and bet sizing, uncertainty, certainty, luck, chance. Where will this conversation be 5 years from now, 25 years from now? Do you think it's always going to just be that the politicians are catering to win the elected seat? Is there ever going to be a breakthrough? Is it going to be something that this topic we're discussing today is going to be a minority topic going forward? It's just never going to get to the mainstream or the masses.
Well, I think it a lot depends on what happens to education. I think we're at a really interesting time because the new technology, the internet, and so on has changed a number of industries. It's changed banking, finance, it's changed publishing, and so on. I think the next big sector that it will change is education. It's already happening with the massive online courses and so on. And so I think if education needs to change because it's still stuck really in the 19th century. And in order to address a lot of the big challenges that face us in the 21st century, from climate change to terrorism to the economy, people are going to have to become much more risk intelligent. They're going to have to be able to operate better in that domain of uncertainty. So I think it's fundamental that our education system changes and adapts to that. And we start teaching this stuff to kids, not just at high school, but even at primary school. There are ways of doing this that make these apparently complex concepts accessible to even to young children. If we do that, if that happens, then perhaps, and that will be my hope, that it's no longer such a specialist thing, and that hopefully then, as a society, we can address these big challenges more rationally and more successfully.
Dylan, I know you mentioned the website where everyone can take the test, but why don't you mention where people can reach out to you if they want to connect, if they want to check out your website? Where's the best place for everybody to go?
Yeah, well, as I said, probably they can go to my the website www.projectionpoint.com, and they can find my email there, and they're welcome to reach out to me.
Listen, hey, I appreciate it today, and like I said, this is for me. I think 15 years ago, I came into this world looking at it purely from the trading standpoint, and looking at how these. And one of the most successful traders employing this today is a guy named David Harding out of London. And there's so many traders out of London these days that are employing these kind of quant models that are all expected value / bet sizing models. And I think it's just terribly interesting. I still think it's the most interesting subject. So I think it's great. And you're right in the middle of it too. So I really appreciate you coming on today and chatting with us.
Well, no, thanks for having me on your show. It's been really interesting.
I appreciate it. And hopefully we can talk again in the new year, and keep me posted when the new books arrive, because I know they will be arriving.
You bet.
Okay. Thanks, Dylan.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.